Why aid for Gaza is still stuck near Rafah crossing in Egypt. Cairo, it's been a week since the Rafah crossing between Gaza and Egypt was effectively shut, following Israeli airstrikes on the main passage for possible relief convoys and an exit route for people desperate to leave the besieged Palestinian territory. As the humanitarian situation inside Gaza worsens, hundreds of tons of aid remain stuck on the Egyptian side of the crossing, despite growing international calls to provide relief to Gazan civilians. Meanwhile, foreign passport holders on the Palestinian side are looking for a way out. Questions and confusion remain over why Rafah is still closed. On Monday, following reports that Egypt, Israel, and the United States had reached a deal to reopen the crossing, trucks filled with aid lined the road in Arish, the closest city in Egypt, while foreigners and dual nationals crowded the gates on the Palestinian side. But Israel and Hamas denied that an agreement was reached. Marathon talks between U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's war cabinet, which stretched into early Tuesday, yielded no announcement on a deal, even as trucks carrying aid began moving from Arish closer to the Rafah crossing. The aid trucks later turned around. Here's what we know. Why is the Rafah crossing so important? The crossing between the southern edge of the Gaza Strip and Egypt's northern Sinai region is the only link from Gaza that Israel does not control. Gaza has been under a blockade enforced by Israel and Egypt since 2007, when Hamas took control of the enclave. In peacetime, the Rafah crossing serves as a vital passageway for Palestinians living outside Gaza to visit relatives there, and for residents of the Strip to receive medical treatment in Egypt. Egypt maintains tight control over the border, and people wishing to cross must get permission from Palestinian and Egyptian authorities. Northern Sinai, where Egypt has battled Islamist militants for a decade, is heavily militarized. Egypt has long feared spillover instability from Gaza. What happened at Rafah? On October 7, Hamas militants based in Gaza launched a multi-pronged assault on Israel that has killed at least 1,400 Israelis. People and goods were able to cross through Rafah for several days afterward. Rafah stopped operating on October 10, when retaliatory Israeli strikes damaged the crossing. Israel's bombing in Gaza has wounded or killed thousands of Palestinians. Israel has also cut off food, fuel, electricity, and water to the more than 2 million residents of the Strip. Drinking water is running out, and the United Nations has sounded the alarm about the potential for disease to spread without proper sanitation. Hospitals are overcrowded and running out of generators and supplies. An Israeli evacuation warning Saturday, calling for 1.1 million residents of northern Gaza to move south, ahead of an expected ground invasion, has worsened the crisis, according to aid workers. We are on the verge of the abyss in the Middle East, said UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres on Sunday. Who controls Rafah? The Rafah crossing is formally controlled by Egypt and Palestinian authorities in Gaza. But Israel controls the skies, and continues to bomb the area. About 80 people were killed in strikes on Rafah and the nearby Gaza town of Khan Yunis in the past 24 hours, the Hamas-run Interior Ministry wrote on Facebook on Tuesday afternoon local time. There is no authorization for the safe passage of the multitude of lorries and trucks that are amassed between Arish and the border crossing in Rafah, waiting to enter under safe conditions, Egyptian Foreign Minister Sami Choukri told the BBC on Tuesday. But Egypt has its own political and security concerns and wants to avoid having a large number of Palestinians crossing into Egypt. Authorities in Cairo have said they won't permit foreign nationals to cross into Sinai unless there is a pause in hostilities to allow aid through, Mustafa Bakri, a member of the Egyptian parliament, told Egyptian newspaper Al-Masri Al-Yawm. Israeli officials said last week that no aid can enter Gaza until Israeli hostages captured by Hamas are released. Israel is also concerned about weapons being smuggled into Gaza through aid convoys. Over the weekend, officials discussed the possibility of setting up a screening mechanism that would allow the Israelis to inspect goods entering Gaza, the Washington Post reported. But for Egypt, having Israeli inspectors operating on its soil is a non-starter. What is the U.S. role? Opening the Rafah crossing to humanitarian aid, and to foreign nationals, including Americans, wishing to exit Gaza, was a key topic of discussion during Blinken's whirlwind Middle East tour in recent days. U.S. diplomats are trying to monitor the Rafah crossing, but Egyptian officials have held them back, citing specific security threats, a State Department official told the Post on Monday, speaking on the condition of anonymity to discuss a sensitive diplomatic matter. Where do negotiations stand? After Blinken met with Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi in Cairo on Sunday, he said that Rafah will be opened and that aid will get to the people who need it. President Biden appointed former Ambassador David Satterfield on Sunday to lead the United States' humanitarian efforts related to the conflict. Satterfield was dispatched to Egypt to help coordinate aid. On Monday, the U.S. Embassy in Israel encouraged Americans in Gaza to move toward the crossing, amid reports that it might open. But Israel and Hamas said they had not agreed to a temporary ceasefire. Martin Griffiths, the UN Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, was scheduled to arrive in Cairo on Tuesday, followed by UN Chief Guterres on Wednesday to make the case for an urgent humanitarian corridor to Gaza. There's a lot of finger-pointing about who's responsible, but ultimately the people who are in a position to make those decisions aren't making those decisions right now, said Richard Brennan, Regional Emergency Director for the World Health Organization's Eastern Mediterranean Office. Karen DeYoung, Annabelle Timsit and John Hudson contributed to this report. Biden could face physical risks in flying to war-torn Middle East. President heads into area subject to rocket and bomb attacks, though experts say he will be heavily protected. When President Biden arrives in Israel on Wednesday, he will be flying into an active war zone where hostilities are high and the course and breadth of the war between Israel and Hamas remain extraordinarily unpredictable. Israel and Hamas have exchanged fierce rocket fire and aerial strikes since Palestinian gunmen from Hamas stormed through the Israel-Gaza border on October 7 and launched the deadliest terrorist attack in Israel's history, killing more than 1,400 Israelis. Israel has launched an aerial counterattack that has killed roughly 3,000 people in Gaza and incited outrage across the Middle East. Adding to the risks of Biden's trip was a deadly airstrike on a Gaza hospital on Tuesday that killed at least 500 people, according to the Palestinian Health Ministry. Palestinian officials say an Israeli airstrike hit the hospital courtyard where displaced Gazans were taking shelter, while the Israel Defense Forces blamed an errant rocket from the Palestinian Islamic Jihad militant group, saying a barrage of rockets was passing near the hospital when it was hit. The hospital bombing has set off fierce protests in the Middle East, including in Jordan, where the Israeli embassy was surrounded by protesters Tuesday evening. A planned visit by Biden to Amman on Wednesday was cancelled after the strike, forcing the U.S. president to forego a scheduled meeting with Jordanian King Abdullah II, Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, and Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas. A White House official said Biden looks forward to consulting in person with these leaders soon, and agreed to remain regularly and directly engaged with each of them over the coming days. Some security experts said the physical risk to Biden would be relatively small despite the chaos in the region. Biden is one of the most protected people on the planet, they said, and Air Force One is equipped with sophisticated air defense systems that can thwart incoming rockets and missiles. Perhaps the safest plane on planet Earth is Air Force One, said Bilal Saab, senior fellow and director of the Middle East Institute's Defense and Security Program. Air Force One is perfectly capable of handling any kind of missile launch or rocket launch inside Gaza. Still, it's a rarity for a president to travel directly into a region where hostilities are intensifying, with an Israeli ground incursion into Gaza expected within days and fears that the militant group Hezbollah might enter the fray. Biden faces at least some risk when he is on the ground in Tel Aviv, a city Hamas rockets are able to reach. In Amman, which Biden had planned to visit after his stop in Tel Aviv, the situation remains combustible. Being in an active area of hostilities, they have to look very carefully at the threats that Israel is facing now, understanding that the president will be on the ground, said Jonathan Lord, senior fellow and director of the Middle East Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. So they're definitely thinking about Israel's air defense capabilities and protecting the president from Hamas rockets. He added, by and large, they're thinking about the same threats that Israelis are now facing on a day-to-day basis. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin have both been to Israel since the Hamas attack, providing more assurance that Biden can travel there safely, experts said. A meeting between Blinken and Israel's war cabinet this week was interrupted by air sirens warning of incoming rocket fire, sending the top U.S. diplomat and Israeli military officials rushing into a nearby shelter. The dramatic moment underscored the risks that persist with high-level U.S. visits to Israel. The current crisis erupted on October 7, when Hamas militants broke through Israel's sophisticated border fence with Gaza and hunted Israeli civilians in their cars and homes, shot people indiscriminately and took scores of hostages into Gaza, including some Americans. Tensions have only grown since then as the brutality and scope of Hamas's attacks have become clearer and as Israel has launched repeated deadly airstrikes in Gaza. Biden's visit comes as Israel is expected to launch a ground invasion that it says is an effort to destroy Hamas, potentially setting off one of the worst conflicts in the region in decades. U.S. officials are deeply concerned that the war could spread and draw in such actors as Hezbollah or Iran. Biden has stressed his ironclad support for Israel since the Hamas attacks, but in recent days, he has sought to strike a more delicate balance between support for Israel's right to self-defense and concern about civilians in Gaza, where conditions have rapidly deteriorated. Gaza is a densely populated enclave of more than 2 million people, about half of whom are children. Even without a formal occupation, Israel controls almost all aspects of life in the territory. Israel announced a full siege of Gaza in response to the Hamas attacks, cutting off food, water, electricity, and fuel, tactics that human rights groups have said violate international law. The country has also unleashed an unrelenting bombardment campaign and warned more than 1 million Palestinians to flee northern Gaza to avoid being in harm's way, an order that the United Nations called impossible. Biden and his top aides have said they are working to secure humanitarian corridors so that Palestinian civilians can flee and aid can get into the Palestinian territory. Despite the combustible conditions, the United States has the benefit of Israeli intelligence and air defense capabilities in helping to protect Biden, experts said. Still, that intelligence conspicuously fell short in detecting the Hamas attacks. Experts said Biden's trip to Kyiv this year was in some ways more dangerous than the Israel trip because Russia has a far more sophisticated military than Hamas. Although Hamas is arguably a far more unpredictable entity, its militants are unlikely to have the technology or prowess to launch a targeted attack against an American president. In terms of threats and risks, Hamas and their capabilities pale in comparison to the Russian military, Lord said. For the Kyiv trip, White House officials did not disclose Biden's whereabouts until he had safely entered the city. In contrast, the president's trip to Tel Aviv was publicly announced by Blinken on Monday. Biden is not the first U.S. president to visit an active war zone, although generally such visits take place in areas where American troops are engaged in active fighting. President Barack Obama visited Iraq and Afghanistan, and President George W. Bush also visited both war zones multiple times. President Bill Clinton visited Gaza City during his presidency, a trip that alarmed the Secret Service at the time but occurred without incident, said Bruce Riedel, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution who served in the Clinton administration. Riedel said the bigger risk in coming days could be faced by members of Biden's entourage and White House staffers who are not as protected as the president. The risk to the president himself is probably pretty minimal. He is surrounded by Secret Service, and the Israelis will provide additional protection layers, Riedel said. He added that Biden flying in and out of the Middle East in one day, rather than staying in an easily identifiable location overnight, further minimizes the risks. White House officials said they have not sought assurances that Israel will not launch its ground invasion while Biden is visiting the country, despite their deep concern that the Israel-Gaza war could escalate into a broader regional conflict. Biden has warned other actors, particularly Iran, not to jump into the fighting. But U.S. officials say they recognize that anger among Arab citizens over the humanitarian crisis and Israel's military strikes in Gaza could boil over and create pressure for their leaders to take action against Israel. White House officials have been working to assure Arab partners that they are trying to get aid into Gaza and minimize civilian casualties. In recent days, Biden has made a point of stressing the distinction between Hamas and ordinary Palestinians. I think we have seen a significant shift in the administration's position, Riedel said. On October 7, it was, "We're 100% behind Israel. We have Israel's back. We're still behind Israel, "We still have Israel's back, but we're also eager to avoid significant civilian casualties in Gaza, and we do not want the conflict to spread to other areas." Ahead of Biden visit, Israel's treatment of civilians looms large. Israel's treatment of civilians in Gaza poses a deepening dilemma for the Biden administration, as officials scramble to illustrate strong support for a core U.S. ally following Hamas' brutal assault while grappling with a spiraling human toll that could threaten Israel's international backing and undermine America's own steps to shield non-combatants from harm. The plight of civilians is drawing intense global scrutiny ahead of President Biden's planned Wednesday visit to Israel, where the U.S. leader will underscore his backing for America's closest Middle Eastern partner, still reeling from the devastating surprise attack that killed at least 1,400 people near the country's border with the Gaza Strip. Palestinian authorities said at least 500 people were killed in a strike on a crowded hospital in Gaza City on Tuesday, adding a dramatic escalation to a death toll that already stood above 2,000 since Israeli forces began pounding the densely populated area with airstrikes following Hamas' October 7 assault. As many as 1 million people were ordered to flee south as bombardment reduces much of northern Gaza to rubble and conditions deteriorate following Israel's suspension of water and electricity to the Hamas-ruled enclave, posing an additional test for Biden as he flies to the Middle East. Biden, in a statement issued as he travels to Israel, said he was outraged by the hospital explosion. "The United States," he said, "stands unequivocally for the protection of civilian life during conflict." In turn, Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas cancelled his planned meeting with Biden, and a summit that was to include Biden and the leaders of Egypt and Jordan also was called off. The potential for far greater casualties during Israel's expected ground offensive against Hamas will likely intensify the challenges that Biden, who has positioned his administration as a chief defender of global norms amid what U.S. officials characterize as Russia's illegal and immoral attacks on civilians in Ukraine, must navigate in his show of solidarity with Israel. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has vowed to demolish Hamas as Israel comes together to prevent further attacks. But Kenneth Pollack, a Middle East expert at the American Enterprise Institute, said Israel risks repeating the missteps America made in the wake of 9/11, when a shaken nation embraced a broad military and intelligence response that ultimately alienated many early supporters and inspired a new generation of anti-American sentiment worldwide. This is the delicate tightrope the Biden administration has to walk. "They've got to deal with people who are just like us 22 years ago," Pollack said. "They've got to be simultaneously sympathetic with the Israelis, and give them the benefit of the wisdom of our mistakes." Since the outset of the conflict, the Biden administration has declared the protection of civilian life and humanitarian assistance a priority even as it refrains from criticizing Israeli tactics. Administration officials including Secretary of State Antony Blinken have pressed Israeli leaders in recent days, with mixed results, to embrace steps they hope will minimize civilian suffering, focusing their pleas on facilitating the entry of aid into Gaza. Biden himself, a longtime supporter of Israel who has issued an emotional condemnation of Hamas' act of sheer evil, has pledged unqualified support for Israel's goal of obliterating the group. But the president and his aides, facing pressure from within the Democratic Party to curb the violence, also are warning Israel against reoccupying Gaza and saying they expect Israel to adhere to the laws of war. The crisis complicates an ongoing Biden administration effort to develop far-reaching safeguards to prevent civilian deaths in wartime, an issue that dogged the United States during 2 decades of counterinsurgent wars. While the Pentagon conceded at least 1,300 civilian deaths in operations against the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, for example, watchdogs say the true toll is likely far higher. "You have an administration that has made very public commitments to improve how it addresses civilian harm, including with partners," said Annie Scheel, U.S. Advocacy Director at the Center for Civilians in Conflict. "And if the U.S. isn't going to be firm with Israel about civilian harm and its obligations, then those commitments seem like they go out the window." Last year, the Biden administration stood up a first-of-its-kind initiative to prevent, track and respond to civilian casualties caused by U.S. military operations. Biden also approved new guidelines for arms transfers that elevate the role of human rights and international humanitarian law in approving such transactions. More recently, the State Department established a first-of-its-kind process for responding to suspected incidents in which allied countries have used U.S.-made weapons against civilians. Legal experts said that expanding U.S. military support for Israel meanwhile carries with it weighty considerations for the United States as reported Palestinian casualties mount. Already, the administration has positioned 2 aircraft carriers in the eastern Mediterranean, dispatched an amphibious task force to the area, and expedited shipments of munitions and air defense missiles. How Israel employs U.S.-origin weapons, experts said, may now have new implications for the United States. Israel has long been the top recipient of annual U.S. military aid, receiving more than $3 billion a year. Brian Finucane, who served as a State Department attorney during the Obama administration, said the considerations include domestic laws governing arms sales specifying that U.S. weapons can be sold to other countries for the goal of legitimate self-defense and international laws that could, in theory, implicate a donor of military aid to a nation that then goes on to violate the laws of war with those arms. That issue echoes the internal debates that occurred during the height of the war in Yemen, when some U.S. officials warned that American military support to Saudi Arabia could implicate the United States in repeated Saudi strikes on Yemeni civilians. While U.S. officials have publicly voiced confidence that Israel will conduct a responsible campaign, strikes like the one that hit the Al-Ali hospital in central Gaza City on Tuesday should at a minimum prompt hard questions from officials involved in approving arms sales, Finucane said. Israeli authorities blamed the attack on a Palestinian militant group. It's deeply problematic to simply assume that a foreign partner will comply with a law of war and that all civilian deaths will be incidental, said Finucane, who is now a senior advisor at the International Crisis Group. The situation could also create broader diplomatic challenges for Washington as it seeks to marshal global support for Israel. While major powers like Russia and China have already criticized Israeli tactics and called for a ceasefire, European leaders have so far sought to illustrate their solidarity. But even they face challenges in navigating the conflict's global context, as demonstrated by the backlash that European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen faced after she expressed full solidarity for Israel on Friday without also mentioning civilian casualties in Gaza. European diplomats privately worried that she risked undermining global support for Europe's efforts to help Ukraine by seeming to turn a blind eye to the deaths of Palestinian civilians while highlighting Russia's attacks on Ukrainians. The United Nations has cautioned that Israel's siege of the enclave and its evacuation order could violate international law. The administration's struggle to secure measures benefiting civilians reveals the limits of U.S. influence at a moment of intense regional crisis. In the opening days of the war, the Biden administration's first humanitarian initiative was to negotiate the safe passage of Palestinian civilians from Gaza to Egypt through the Rafah border. The administration quickly abandoned that plan after consultations with Arab partners who opposed the proposal out fear that fleeing Palestinians may never be able to return to Gaza, a major hang-up given the painful history of generations of Palestinian refugees. I've heard directly from Palestinian Authority President Abbas and from virtually every other leader that I've talked to in the region, that idea is a non-starter, Blinken told Al Arabiya on Sunday. We believe that people should be able to stay in Gaza, their home. As a result, the Biden administration switched tactics and embraced the idea of establishing safe zones inside Gaza. Our focus now is on helping to create safe zones, Blinken, in the midst of a marathon regional tour, told reporters in Qatar. We're doing that with the leading international organizations. Thus far, the U.S. plan for safe zones has yet to materialize. Despite a bargaining session between Blinken and Israel's war cabinet that went for more than 7 hours from Monday evening into the early hours of Tuesday morning, the two sides were only able to agree to develop a plan that will include the possibility of creating areas to help keep civilians out of harm's way, Blinken said after emerging from the meeting. The announcement included no timeline for when this would be established or any details about how such safe zones might work in a densely populated territory where civilians and militants are nestled in tightly together. Another message that Arab leaders underscored was that a humanitarian collapse in Gaza would enrage the Muslim world and potentially destabilize their own populations. Those sentiments drove U.S. officials to prioritize the shipment of aid into Gaza in discussions with Israel's war cabinet, a humanitarian challenge that took up more time than any other topic in the meeting, according to a State Department official who spoke on the condition of anonymity to discuss a sensitive issue. Even then, however, the two sides only agreed that they continue to work on a plan that will enable humanitarian aid from donor nations and multilateral organizations to reach civilians in Gaza, Blinken said. While Blinken's discussions with Arab leaders helped move the Biden administration away from a focus on moving Palestinians out of Gaza and toward safe zone, the two sides continue to disagree on the issue of de-escalation. During Blinken's meeting with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, the Saudi leader stressed the need to stop the military operations that claimed the lives of innocent people, a reference to Israel's offensive, and lift the siege of Gaza, according to the Saudi summary of the meeting. The Crown Prince also called for a halt in the current escalation in the conflict. During Blinken's meeting in Cairo with Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, the Egyptian strongman said Israel's assaults have exceeded the right of self-defense and turned into collective punishment. By contrast, a leaked State Department memo, confirmed by the Washington Post, warned U.S. diplomats from using the phrases de-escalation/ceasefire, end to violence/bloodshed and restoring calm as the words do not comport with current U.S. policy. U.S. officials continue to insist that Israel be allowed to wage an operation that will eradicate Hamas, even as security experts worry that the bombing campaign, involving thousands of bombs, has already had a devastating toll on civilians. Hudson reported from Amman, Jordan. Michael Birnbaum in Washington contributed to this report. White House weighs $100 billion for Israel-Ukraine bill, plans in flux. Budget officials plan a major request to Congress as U.S. faces foreign policy crises on multiple fronts. White House officials are considering asking Congress for an aid package primarily aimed at supporting Ukraine and Israel that could cost as much as $100 billion, although that preliminary estimate may change as planning remains in flux, according to 4 people briefed on the matter. In conversations with congressional staffers, Biden aides have discussed proposing as soon as this week a major foreign policy package amid numerous international crises, including the war between Hamas and Israel. The legislation is also expected to include substantial funds to bolster U.S. immigration enforcement at the southern border with Mexico, and may include funds for Taiwan to deter aggression from China, said the people, who spoke on the condition of anonymity to reflect private conversations. Money to respond to recent U.S. natural disasters, including wildfires in Maui and various hurricanes, could also be folded into the legislation. Aides stressed that the plans were highly uncertain and subject to change. President Biden previously proposed roughly $20.4 billion in funding for Ukraine, but Congress blocked any additional money for Ukraine when it extended government funding into November. It's going to make a strong statement to our enemies and to our friends, Senator Lindsey Graham, Republican, South Carolina, said about the proposed aid package. One person, speaking on the condition of anonymity to describe private conversations, said the request would cover a full fiscal year for the crises it is intended to address. Democratic leaders said they expect to receive the proposal at the end of this week. We intend to get the package at the end of this week, and it will include the military help Israel needs, the diplomatic and intelligence help Israel needs, as well as humanitarian aid to minimize the loss of innocent human life, of Palestinians and of Israelis, Senate Majority Leader Charles E. Schumer, Democrat, New York, told reporters. The effort comes as House Republicans struggle to elect a new speaker, which could complicate efforts to pass any bill swiftly. House Republicans have grown increasingly wary of providing taxpayer funds to Kyiv, but may be more likely to do so if a request also includes money for the border and Israel. Bloomberg first reported that White House officials were considering a $100 billion request in the aid package. It was unclear how much money would be included for each country. A White House spokeswoman declined to comment. How conservative media figures helped to fuel the GOP speaker chaos. From Steve Bannon to Sean Hannity, right-wing media stars have had enormous influence over Republicans' search for a leader. Fox News host Sean Hannity vented to his millions of viewers Monday night about the state of the Republican effort to name a new House Speaker, taking special aim at the few sensitive little snowflakes in Congress who were not supporting his preferred GOP candidate, Representative Jim Jordan of Ohio. But the widely watched conservative pundit wasn't only using his televised bully pulpit to pressure the holdouts. Hannity also spent the weekend personally calling several and having one of his producers reach out to others to lobby them on their vote. He also took to social media to encourage his followers to call wavering members and demand they fall into line. Hannity's effort to personally whip up votes for Jordan highlights the central role that right-wing media has played in the weeks-long drama engulfing Capitol Hill over who will wield the Speaker's gavel. At each turn, conservative media figures such as Hannity and former Trump advisor Stephen K. Bannon have injected high-profile disruption into a process that normally plays out quietly behind the scenes in Capitol Hill corridors. A handful of backbench lawmakers have seized the opportunity to flex their power in a nearly evenly split chamber, creating drama but offering little direction. As of Tuesday afternoon, when Jordan lost an initial vote of the full House, it was unclear whether the turbulent series of events would end with a congressman long relegated to the hard-right fringe elevated to lead the chamber. But the overall picture of the legislative branch in chaos, and the allure of the media spotlight helping to drive the dysfunction, was well established. Politics today rewards attention and money more than it rewards actually getting bills passed into law, said Mac Thornberry, a 13-term congressman from Texas who was the top Republican on the House Armed Services Committee before announcing his retirement in 2019. Thornberry likened the shift to a social media algorithm that serves up ever more outrageous content to get more eyeballs. Now to keep your attention, politicians have to be all the more sensational, he said. I fear we are in a spiral. The uncertainty over who would preside over the House began this month when Representative Kevin McCarthy, Republican, California, was ousted by a band of rebellious hard-right members. The leader, Representative Matt Gaetz, Republican, Florida, had become a right-wing media star based on his willingness to topple the established order. Then House Republicans' original preferred replacement, Representative Steve Scalise, Republican, Louisiana, had to withdraw from contention after failing to consolidate the support of hard-right members and the media figures who back them. Now Hannity and others are leaning on Jordan's critics to get behind the Ohio congressman, who has long been a favorite of Fox News and other conservative outlets. The campaign by Hannity to boost Jordan, who has also been endorsed for the Speaker's job by former President Donald Trump, began soon after Scalise withdrew from the race. On Friday afternoon, Hannity tweeted that any member of Congress would be crazy to not support Jim Jordan for Speaker. He is a natural-born, principled leader who will lead House Republicans to unite versus the radical left. Hannity went on to provide the switchboard number for the House of Representatives, and urged his followers to call your member and tell them. Over the weekend, Hannity reached out to several holdout lawmakers who were not supporting Jordan, while one of his producers contacted lawmakers with an email asking why they weren't backing him. The producer's email, which was first reported by Axios and has been confirmed by the Washington Post, included a leading question. Hannity would like to know why during a war breaking out between Israel and Hamas, with a war in Ukraine, with the wide-open borders, with a budget that's unfinished, why would Rep. XXX be against Rep. Jim Jordan for Speaker? Hannity has been joined in his quest by other high-profile hosts, including Bannon, who has helped to spur the pressure campaign for Jordan on his podcast, War Room. After the Republican caucus nominated Jordan on Friday, Bannon ran a segment on his show publicizing the congressional phone number of Representative Steve Womack, Republican, Arkansas, who had hesitated to support Jordan. Bannon urged his listeners to tell Womack to support Jordan. You're in a super mega district, you gotta get your mind right, Bannon said. On Monday, Gaetz praised Bannon's audience for deluging Republican lawmakers with phone calls urging them to get on what Gaetz called the Jordan train. But in a measure of the limits of those kinds of pressure tactics, Womack on Tuesday was among the 20 Republicans who declined to support Jordan in the floor vote. Womack, who voted for Scalise instead, said the GOP's initial nominee had been kneecapped before he could get his own vote before the full House. It was the most egregious act against a sitting member of our conference I have witnessed, he said. Other efforts to flip votes were more successful. When Representative Mike D. Rogers, Republican, Alabama, who had been a leading Jordan holdout, announced that he would instead back Jordan on Monday, Gaetz broke the news on Bannon's show and it seems as though Congressman Rogers has been sufficiently encouraged, Gaetz said. Some members have been unusually outspoken in blasting their colleagues for playing to the cameras. Representative Mike Collins, Republican, Georgia, tweeted last week that his fellow members were making decisions based on egos and TV time. McCarthy, meanwhile, was unequivocal in identifying what he saw as the reasons Gaetz had moved against him. It had nothing to do about spending, he told reporters shortly after his ouster. It all was about getting attention from you. The dynamic of attention seeking over substance may be more pronounced than it has been in the past, but it is not new. For a long time we've seen politicians who have vied for media attention in order to raise their profile and raise money, said Catherine Brownell, who teaches history at Purdue University. It elevates a slash and burn style and it changes the party to something more about viral moments and less about governance. In the case of the speaker fight, the consequence has been a string of firsts that hint at the underlying chaos, the first 15-round speaker election in nearly 2 centuries when McCarthy was chosen in January, the first ouster of a speaker by a vote of the House when he was deposed this month, and the first vacancy in over half a century to last 2 weeks or more. Eric Bolling, a host for the conservative network Newsmax, said that in recent decades, the biggest media darlings tend to be the ones who get elected, promoted and rise the highest in the political ranks. Chris Stirewalt, a former politics editor at Fox News, noted that the selection of a new speaker is, and should be, a very boring moment to most Americans. Under normal circumstances, most Americans can't name the Speaker of the House. But this time, Stirewalt said, the story has become a personal drama seemingly made for reality television, with the entertainment wing of the GOP fueling the action. The battle between Scalise and Jordan last week was not an ideological struggle, added Stirewalt, who is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and political editor at NewsNation. It's an attitudinal struggle. Scalise and Jordan are both conservatives, but Jordan was willing to do things that Scalise wasn't to try to secure the job. Previous Republican speakers have had tortured tenures as they have attempted to govern in the face of factions trying to wield outsized power by leveraging their influence on the airwaves. For instance, unlike McCarthy, John A. Boehner, Republican, Ohio, wasn't voted out of office. But he did step aside under pressure in 2015 after the Freedom Caucus, led in part by Jordan and backed by Fox, made the Republican conference ungovernable. There's a tendency to blame the fringe of the Republican Party. But those people used to be the fringe and they climbed the party ladder using the same tactics, said Brownell, author of the book 24/7 Politics, Cable Television and the Fragmenting of America from Watergate to Fox News. A case in point is Newt Gingrich, who was Speaker during the late 1990s. After Gates began pushing for McCarthy's ouster this fall, Gingrich wrote an opinion piece accusing Gates of destroying the House GOP's ability to govern. Such allegations are ironic coming from Gingrich, Brownell said, given that Gingrich's rise was largely fueled by his own battlefield mentality in Congress and his willingness to court media attention. It changed the party, making it more about the attention economy and less about governance, she said. When McCarthy was elected Speaker, he was able to win mainstream Republicans over to positions held by the Freedom Caucus, Stirewalt said, which in turn allowed McCarthy to establish his bona fides as a right-wing media star. But once in power, McCarthy had to make deals with Democrats to keep the government functioning. The cycle eventually caught up with him, as it is likely to do with anyone in his position, even a Fox News regular like Jordan, Stirewalt said. Jim Jordan used Fox News and the right-of-center media to great effect over the past decade to force his way into the conference, to force his way into leadership and create all these pressure points, Stirewalt said. So after this long struggle, you hear people saying, we have to stop here. The revolution has to stop here. But I don't see why anyone feels like they have to go along now and behave themselves. Mariana Sotomayor contributed to this report.